Hi, everybody. It's great to have you. Thank you to everybody who is joining us today. This is the first in a series of webinars that are being conducted by the Framework for an Equitable COVID-19 Homelessness Response Team. And today's webinar is really foundational. It is meant to provide information on the key resources that have been made available on housing and homelessness over the last 18 months and link those funds to the interventions that we have in our toolbox to serve people experiencing homelessness and housing instability. My name is Ann Oliva. I use she and her pronouns. And I am joined today, I'm very excited to be joined today by Matthew Doherty from Matthew Doherty Consulting, also the former U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness Executive Director, and my good friend Marc Dones, who is a founding partner in the Framework for an Equitable COVID-19 Homelessness Response and is now the CEO of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. Thanks to both of you for being here. Next slide.
Great, thanks, Ann. So I'm Matthew Doherty, happy to be a part of the team that has been working on the Framework project. You'll see on the screen all of the partners who are involved in implementing the Framework project. And really, we came together in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic to help provide guidance and support to communities as they strengthen their initial responses to the pandemic. And I'd say right now we're continue to be focused on supporting communities in that continued response, but also especially helping to support communities to think about recovery from the pandemic and its impacts, and how to mobilize the array of resources that are coming into communities that support both response and recovery, and to make sure we're driving progress towards ending homelessness, as well as towards racial equity in the implementation of those resources. Next slide.
So as Matthew mentioned, the Framework for an Equitable COVID-19 Homelessness Response was developed in the early days of the pandemic and provides a foundation for all of the work that the partners have done together over the last 18 months or so. And the framework itself is built on these strategies that are highlighted on the page. The first strategy is that we must use these resources to advance racial justice and equity. And we were very careful, and Marc can maybe talk about this a little bit later, but we were very careful about how we talk about racial justice and equity, and we'll get into that in a little while. We also want to make sure that these funds are used to address the needs of folks who are the highest need folks first. That didn't make a ton of sense. Let me try that again. We want to make sure that these funds are used to address the highest needs first. So that means, as you'll see in today's presentation, that we really are focused on folks who are at the most risk of homelessness or who are already experiencing homelessness. We also want to make sure that we are growing the kinds of partnerships that we have in place as homelessness and housing systems. And most importantly, that means partnering with people who have lived expertise in order to develop our policies and program designs, but also means that we're partnering with maybe some non-traditional partners that we haven't worked with before to really get into communities who are historically marginalized and who have been really impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. We want to, of course, get people into housing, and that means that we are serving people who are in unsheltered locations and in shelters, and we are acting with a lot of urgency. So everything that you see here really is focused on acting as quickly as we can while not giving up these other guiding strategies and our values. Next slide.
So this is the first in a planned series of webinars to help communities think through the highest and best and most impactful use of the resources that are becoming available, especially through the American Rescue Plan, but also through the CARES Act and through prior appropriations. So today's focus is really on an overview of the funding resources and some of the strategic guidance around how to use those resources. Next week's webinar will focus on thinking through how to use these resources, not as siloed sources of money, but to knit together a continuum of interventions ranging from rehousing, diversion, homelessness prevention, and eviction prevention, and how all of these funding sources can be best knit together to support priorities that you may have in your community based upon local data. And Barb Poppy will be the lead for that webinar next week. In early August, we'll be doing a webinar focused on landlord engagement and unit cultivation strategies, knowing that that's one of the obstacles communities are facing as they try to mobilize these resources. And our partners at Brilliant Corners, an organization based in California, will be describing their strategies and the principles for doing that work effectively. And then the fourth webinar will focus on how to best align some of the services funding opportunities with the housing resources to create the kinds of opportunities that people need to be successful to both stay stable in housing and also to exit homelessness. Next slide, please. Today's agenda, we're gonna provide an overview of some of the key data points that tell us why we need to lead with a focus on racial equity when we work on preventing and ending homelessness. We'll talk a little bit about the opportunity that we all have to drive historic progress if we use the resources we have in play right now well and wisely. We'll walk through some of the key funding programs and their specifics, and also some top tips as you think about how to mobilize those resources in your communities. And we are intending to turn to Marc along the way for them to be able to share some insights about how they're taking some of the thinking that informs this presentation and applying it to the work in Seattle and King County. And we hope to have time at the end for questions. So as questions get posed in the chat box, Kim Johnson from the coalition will be helping cultivate and curate those questions, and we'll review them, and I'll moderate a Q&A at the end of the session. Next slide, please.
So as reflected in the strategies that I just talked about a minute ago, we always start these presentations when we're doing them by grounding ourselves in racial justice and equity. And for the next few slides, I'm going to speak specifically around racial justice. And I saw that there's a question in the Q&A around serving people who are living with disabilities. That's actually the reason why we chose the language racial justice and equity, because it's not just about, it is primarily about racial justice, but it is also about equity for other historically marginalized populations, including people living with disabilities and LGBTQ people. Next slide. We know that homelessness and housing instability result from racist practices and marginalization of communities. As I mentioned, that includes BIPOC communities, LGBTQ people, and people living with disabilities. But we also know that how we use the funds that we have access to right now is incredibly important for those same historically marginalized populations. And using a racial justice and equity approach is key to addressing the challenges and problems that have only been exacerbated by the pandemic. Next slide, please. So when we think about how to use and target these funds, we really recommend that communities consider the following data. First, Black renters face the highest rates of eviction, and that is especially true for Black women. Next slide. Renters of color have faced the greatest hardships during the pandemic. Next slide. And not surprisingly to anybody who's on this webinar today, people of color are more likely to experience homelessness. And what we really want folks to do is, of course, think about this national data. It's incredibly important, but we also want you to think about your local conditions as you are doing policy development and planning for these funds. And we also want to address racial justice and equity by asking impacted people about program design and what they want and need. And so, Marc, can you turn on your camera? Hi, it's so nice to see you. Welcome to the webinar today.
Hello.
So, as I mentioned when I introduced you, you were a founding member of the team that developed the framework for an equitable COVID-19 homelessness response. And I will credit you with having sort of the strongest hand in building our racial justice and equity approach. So now that you've moved to the local level and are doing implementation in King County, can you talk about how this work is translating to decision-making at the local level, and like talk a little bit about how communities should be thinking about addressing inequities among historically marginalized groups with this money?
Yeah, your sound is wonky, Ann, just so you know. It sounds like you sound fishbowl, like you're in and out. But a couple thoughts. So one, our community. So for folks who don't know me, my name is Marc Dones, they, them, theirs pronouns. I have recently become the CEO of the brand new King County Regional Homelessness Authority, which is the agency that has span of control for homelessness in the Seattle King County region. And we are also the COC lead agency. I think that a couple things are really important, right? One is from an implementation perspective, communities really need to be leaning on the COVID prioritization frameworks that are possible underneath the waivers that have been developed by HUD during the pandemic. We understand that historically marginalized communities are most impacted by COVID. That's also not surprising, right? But what that means is that we can also prioritize resources towards those communities right now in a way that candidly we have not been able to do before, right? And so it's really critical that if your community is looking to implement anything related to remaining CARES Act dollars, ARPA dollars, the EHV allocations that have come online, that you be looking towards your sort of COVID prioritization capacity as a way to really enhance your ability to reach historically marginalized populations. I believe that also to be inclusive of as Ann mentioned, right? Folks who are not, we're not talking just about race ethnicity when we talk about historically marginalized, right? We are talking about LGBTQ, particularly trans populations. We are talking about folks living with disabilities. We're talking about survivors, right? We know that there are a number of populations who, by the nature of the bodies that they live in inside the oppressive systems in our country, are at enhanced risk for COVID. And that has given us the ability for the first time to straightforwardly prioritize them. If you are looking to spend your money creatively and you don't have COVID prioritization in place, now is the time to really get that up and running.
Thank you so much, Marc. Before I hand it over to Matthew, I just want to check, does my sound seem better? Awesome. Marc, thank you for that answer and for all the work that you're doing to lead the nation in King County. Matthew?
Great, next slide, please. And you can skip right to the next one. So I think one of the unique things about the time we're living in right now is that we have these enormous challenges we've been facing, and oftentimes in the homelessness response sector, we are facing challenges all the time, and those challenges multiply. But right now, we also have a corresponding scaling up of resources, maybe not to the full scale of need, but an infusion of resources through the American Rescue Plan Act, resources still available through the CARES Act, or that came through the December appropriations bill, that allow us to scale and actually start to respond to the challenges that are increasing in our community. And they provide us the historic opportunity as a nation to both drive progress on preventing and ending homelessness, but doing that work in such a way and targeting the resources in such ways that we can, at the same time, drive progress towards racial equity and justice. And this is just a really incredible opportunity to drive progress in both areas, and an opportunity that we have to seize, and we have to pursue both, because if we only pursue progress on preventing and ending homelessness without a focus on equity and justice, we actually are likely to make inequities and injustices worse by infusing resources in ways that aren't thoughtful about existing inequities and how to support progress towards equity and justice. So it's an opportunity and also a risk opportunity. And so we have to balance both of these areas of focus. Next slide, please. And the other interesting thing about this opportunity for folks in the field is we have the opportunity to scale multiple elements of our response to homelessness all at the same time, which hardly ever happens. That you'll get an increase in one pool of funding and you can do something with it, but it doesn't allow you to build out the rest of your system. Right now, we have resources that can work across the full array of interventions needed, from preventing people from losing their housing to quickly rehousing people through a variety of funding sources who are currently experiencing homelessness, EHV vouchers, emergency housing vouchers that can provide long-term housing subsidies for those who most need those subsidies, and also some capital resources that allow us to actually bring more units online. And that it's both a challenge and an opportunity to do all these things at once, but it's less of an environment in which we have to pick one thing only to do to strengthen our system. We can do multiple things right now with these resources to strengthen our systems and our response. Next slide, please. So the opportunity is right now in front of us, and just really critical that we balance both urgency and wisdom in our responses and thoughtfulness so that we move quickly, but we move quickly aligned with best and strongest practices and thinking about how to align the resources strategically and leading with a vision of racial and housing justice at the front end of our decision-making processes and driving and even adding urgency to the actions that we're trying to take. But the opportunity is if we can use these resources well and wisely and make the kind of progress possible through these resources, we can do a lot of work to make the case that both ending homelessness and achieving housing justice are achievable goals. We can demonstrate what it takes to get there and move not all the way to success clearly, but move from something more theoretical to something that's more demonstrable in our communities. And we can do that in communities across the country. Next slide, please. And this slide is an overwhelmingly colorful pie chart that I have trouble focusing on, but it tries to lay out all of the different resources that came through the American Rescue Plan. These are not only the housing focused resources. This is the full array from the $1,400 stimulus checks to the very flexible state and local aid money that was delivered to the unemployment investment. And then buried within here are the housing investments as well. Next slide, please. And this visual illustrates more clearly the housing specific focused investments, including another infusion of resources into the emergency rental assistance program administered by the Department of Treasury. So another $21.5 billion on top of the $25 billion that was delivered through the December consolidated appropriations, the $5 billion for the home program. And this is the funding source that does allow for capital strategies alongside all of these services and rental assistance strategies. The $5 billion that's supporting about 70,000 emergency housing vouchers across the country. Another $5 billion that's for utility assistance, and then $100 million targeted to assisting tenants in USDA subsidized developments. So again, an array of resources at the kind of scaling up that we have not seen in a very long time. The home program alone is like, can't remember what a multiplier it is, but it's like a 20 times multiplier of what the home program typically is provided through this investment through the American Rescue Plan. Next slide, please. Part of what makes it complicated, though, is that the money doesn't all come to one place and one set of decision makers or one team of decision makers to figure out how to put these things together. So this chart lays out where the money comes from, how it's provided to the community. Throughout most of the rest of this presentation, we'll mostly focus on the 4 resources here, though we'll talk about some of the other resources as well, with ERA coming through Treasury, delivered both to states and to local governments. The ESGCV, again, a mix of state and local government awards. The HVs going directly to public housing agencies to administer within their local jurisdictions. And then the home resources spread across states, larger local governments, and mid-sized local governments. The other challenging aspect of this is none of this money actually comes directly to the continuum of care organizations, but all of these entities are expected to be working in close partnership with the continuum of care organizations, and create the opportunity for aligning strategies and investments, but requires a lot of work to make that happen because of the diversity of where the resources flow to. I see Mark smiling, like I may be underselling the complexity of this a little bit. Next
Don't
slide.
worry, I'm going to ask Mark exactly that question in just a minute. So Kim, can you go ahead and put the link to our handout? Thank you so much. Just for everybody who's on today, we did prepare a handout. It's on the framework website. So for the next couple of slides, they are very, they have a lot of information on it. So we wanted to make sure that everybody has a handout in their hands to look at later. So now that we have reviewed sort of what funding is available and the opportunities in front of us, as well as maybe who has received what money, I want to talk a little bit about what interventions are in front of us and how we pay for them. So I'm going to work from left to right on this chart and discuss these 4 interventions in that order. And I'm doing that specifically because at the top of this session, we talked about our values and our strategies being really focused on addressing the highest needs first. So you can see in this chart that the highest need folks are on the left. That is folks who are already experiencing homelessness and need to be rehoused. And in this context, I want to be sure that you know, when we say rehousing, we're not talking just about rapid rehousing. We are talking about all types of rehousing for people who are experiencing homelessness, including rehousing into the emergency housing vouchers, rapid rehousing that can be paid for through other COVID-related funds, and affordable housing and supportive housing. So it's the broad array. So again, starting from the left, the first intervention is rehousing. Our eligible population are really people who are currently experiencing sheltered or unsheltered homelessness. And there are folks who require help with all sorts of things, including rent, moving costs, housing stabilization, and supportive services. Moving to the right, the next intervention that we're going to be talking about is homelessness diversion. And that really is focused on households that are presenting for homelessness assistance, but with some financial or service assistance could actually be diverted from shelter or the streets. A lot of those households have experienced homelessness before and are also coming from highly impacted neighborhoods and communities. Moving one more box, the green box to the right, is homelessness prevention. Homelessness prevention is really a targeted type of intervention that includes largely keeping people in the housing that they're in, but is really targeted at those folks who are at imminent risk of homelessness or households who are doubled up, and include households usually in the 0 to 30% of area median income range. And again, we know from the research that households with a previous episode of homelessness are most likely to experience homelessness again. So that should be a targeting criteria, and that a lot of families and individuals are coming from those highly impacted communities and neighborhoods. And then on the far right, we have eviction prevention. And this is a key intervention that we know communities are working to get this money out the door across the country. So it's incredibly important, but it's also sort of the broadest type of intervention. This is really for folks who there is a future risk of homelessness. They are leaseholders. Sometimes they're in a broader income range, up to 0 to 50% of area median income. But we also want to make sure that these resources are targeted to those who are most likely to experience homelessness down the road. And what I would say about these 4 interventions is that they actually have a core set of activities in common. Those activities include rent or utility assistance, that could be arrears or prospective rent, supportive services, that could look different depending on what the household wants and needs, and then other types of financial assistance like moving costs, security deposits, other types of things that would support housing stability. So we're going to talk about these 4 interventions and then the 3 core activities that make up these interventions. Next slide. So this chart really, oops, sorry, I'm backwards in my notes. Sorry about that, everybody. So again, while we're going to focus on, for the rest of this presentation, sort of the funding streams that are related to housing, and those include the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, the Emergency Solutions Grants CV program, the Emergency Housing Vouchers, and home funding. I think it's really important that to think about your resources in the most comprehensive way possible based on what funding sources you have access to in your community. So this is a broader array of funding sources that are available to states and localities across the country, but every funding source isn't necessarily available in every community. So when we think about how to use these in a comprehensive way, the example that I use is you want to think about using the most specific or targeted money like utility assistance or the ESG CV program first for those activities that they're limited to. And then think about needs and fill in gaps with the more flexible dollars that are available, like the coronavirus relief funds or other state and local government aid. And while we're not going to delve really deeply today into how to mix and match those funds, I just want to put a plug in here that next week, Barb Poppy is leading the second webinar in this series, where she is actually going to provide some scenarios based on what we're seeing locally and really delve into how you can mix and match these funds. Next slide. And again, this is a similar chart with all of the same funding sources on the left, but really broken down by those core activities. So together, these 2 charts give you what I would say is the beginning of a roadmap in terms of how to maximize the use of these new resources, both for the types of interventions that we need to fund and for the specific activities that we need to put in place. And again, these 2 charts together, when you look at them side by side, can allow you to see more clearly how you can mix and match those funds. But it's easy for me to say that, right? Like sitting here in Washington, DC, it is much more complicated, as all of you know, when you're actually doing this implementation at the local level. So, Mark, I'd like for you to weigh in here. You know, the other day you and I were on the phone and we had a chance to catch up, and one of the challenges that you pointed out to me was really about collaboration between the various recipients of these recovery dollars. So can you talk about the challenges that you're experiencing, what collaboration looks like, and maybe how these grantees can work together to be strategic in the use of these resources?
Sure. Yeah, sorry, everyone. Anyone who's interacted with me before knows that I have no poker face. And it's one of the reasons why I don't often lie, and we're all confused how I've survived this long in politics. But it's quite complicated. You know, one of the things that I will say as a newly minted local leader is the templatizing of relationships early is the most effective strategy that you will have, I think, in your community with success, right? So the sort of early and often mantra that we see in other places applies here as well. And I do believe that I want to echo what Ann and Matthew have said, which is like there's a tremendous opportunity in front of us. But with that opportunity comes the challenge of integrating work across a number of systems that have historically not worked together, right? And we should name, because it's right here in the room with us, right? That the COCs and the housing authorities have not necessarily always worked together or had the same populations of focus. And so particularly with the emergency housing vouchers, right? I think that is introducing a new relationship for a lot of communities. It's also just an important relationship, right? Like, I think that like the federal move to make that relationship mandatory is smart. And I think that like requiring us at the local level to begin to build those bridges is a really strong step towards actually addressing homelessness, right? It's critical that we remember always that housing is the thing that fixes homelessness. And if we're not actually connected to our housing systems, then we are left, frankly, trying to cobble together a parallel housing system rather than having that integrated approach. So I would say, reach out, have the conversations, templatize, right? If this is the direction that we anticipate from this administration, and I think that's what we're seeing, then the more that we can create templates that are going to work for us at the local level, the more that we can then bubble those up to our national partners and our TA partners so that they can then spread them around, right? I think that's really helpful. The other thing that I would say is a little bit of population segmentation goes a long way. And so, I encourage, what we've done here is really, again, look at our COVID prioritization and think about who is the most vulnerable. And to Ann's point, sort of walking through the sort of, which streams might be applied at which stages in, sort of lack of stability or sort of stability, right? Depending on how you want to approach that. What we've really said is, here is a brand new, really important resource that is much needed. Let's try to drive as much of it as we can towards those who are most vulnerable, which includes for us, people who are literally homeless, right? We've taken at our level a slightly broader definition of literal homelessness, I'm going to be a little bit honest. But right, we want to make sure that folks who do not have a safe, stable, permanent place that they're going every night are the first priority for us. But in doing that, right, what you have to do is pull apart particularly levels of acuity, right? That's the population segmentation that matters most here. Because as this slide very helpfully points out, there are some things that are service connected, there are some things that are eligible to pay for services, and there are some things that are neither, right? And so acuity is what's going to matter most in your local conversations, rather than, is it a young person, is it a family, is it a, so we have really begun to look at what tools do we have to measure acuity in a real-time way. What assessments do we have that are already in our toolbox that can measure acuity? I'll be candid, some of our vulnerability assessments don't really measure acuity. And so it's different enough that we're starting to have some conversations about how we do that better. Because what we want to make sure is that we are connecting people with the appropriate service level. As we know, right, and I think it's always important to say this, roughly 80% of the population experiencing homelessness doesn't actually need deep-end services, right? But about 20% does. And it's really important that we know who we're talking to when we're having the conversation about which kind of support and therefore which funding, right, is going to be most applicable. The other thing, and perhaps the last thing that I would say, is this is a tremendous opportunity. A lot of what we struggle with, particularly in my region, is a market that is bad. And so to have a conversation about bringing new stuff online, particularly in the voucher space or in the, not without having actual facilities, right, is a little bit tough because we worry about whether or not the market can absorb any kind of voucher, either through the emergency housing vouchers or other vouchers that we might create, for example, out of the ARPA or CV funding. But I think this is actually a tremendous opportunity to take a step back and look at your system from a flow-through perspective. And can you use your EHV allocations or vouchers that you create out of ARPA or CARES Act dollars to create essentially move-on style programs, right? Are there ways that you can assist people who are in perhaps PSH or supportive housing, or even frankly, deep in subsidy programming, who might now be able to support themselves with a lighter subsidy, right? Can you create strategic flows in the system that then allow you to bring in more people who are either currently literally unhoused or may have more complex needs that are not currently being met wherever they are being housed?
I'm going to go just a teeny bit off script because I think you raised a couple of items that I'd like just to do a follow-up on. The first is the point that you just made around thinking about flow, and and also the point around services. So to the extent that maybe some of these resources can be used to move folks on from supportive housing that don't need those intensive services anymore, then you're freeing up a slot. It doesn't mean they have to move units. You can switch out the subsidy, right? That feels like a really important point for folks to be thinking about. So I'll ask for your reaction on that in a minute. The other question that I had for you, Marc, is who's convening these really important discussions in your community or in other communities that you're talking to? Is it foundations? Is it the COC? Is it the government? Is it you? Like, who's convening them?
So on the convening point, I am now the government. and so we are doing a lot of the convening. Yeah. I will say that from a convening perspective, I would encourage, so we interact a lot with people experiencing homelessness as a primary driver of how we think about our policymaking. And we're very fortunate to have a group called the Lived Experience Coalition, who we work with very closely on a number of fronts, who help us drive our policy articulations. And I will be really transparent. It was our conversations with people experiencing homelessness that led us to develop our move on strategy. So if you're not working with people who are experiencing homelessness, you are missing out on real brilliance that can absolutely change the course of how you use this money. I will also say, related to that, right, that we work really hard not to convene new tables, but instead to figure out like, where are people already talking and can we go hang out there, right? Yeah. And so, depending on, if it's a brand new relationship, right? If it's the COC lead and the housing authorities, that's some phone calls and some, okay, we gotta get on a Zoom, a Skype, or whatever. Skype, I don't know that we're using Skype, whatever. I just dated myself. Everyone forget I said that. But if we have to sort of build that new relationship, then sure. But for a lot of the other conversations, we're really trying to ensure that we are going to where people are, going to existing coalition meetings, asking for input, really trying to build a collaborative and community-based process, even though the timelines were kind of brutal, but we did the best we could and we'll continue to do the best we can. To that point, I would lift up on the timeline point and on the community engagement point, I would lift up something that Ann, you said to me the other day, which is the MOUs that structure the deployment of these resources are not final in terms of like, you can never change them, right? So it is important that we understand that if we learn something or see that something isn't working, if a pathway that we articulate is not actually moving people forward the way that we want it to, we're not stuck, right? Like we can always, I know it is administratively burdensome, it's never what we want to do, but we can amend the MOUs that are structuring the resource deployment in order to better meet the needs of people. And the only other thing I would say on the convening front is that a little bit of the disability justice framework, right? Of every room you're in, ask who couldn't make it and ask how you're going to talk to them next. And that's just a really important thing for us, right? Like it has led us, I think, to consistently sort of be like, well, so for example, folks who are vehicular residents, right, who are experiencing, who are living in vehicles, are not often in our conversations, are not often in our rooms, right? And so we did some work to engage with some folks who represent that population, and then we're able to articulate a clarity around a pathway, again, modifying our definition of literally unsheltered, right, to be clear that we were including their vehicular homelessness. So that, I think, is also really important.
Yep, that's awesome, Mark. I think a lot of folks who are residing in vehicles get left out of conversations, and it's really important. So I'm gonna thank you for your thoughts on that. I'm gonna shift us now. If you go to the next slide, we're gonna shift a little bit and talk really much more specifically about the 4 housing specific funding streams that we have in place right now. So now that you have that like broader roadmap, you've heard a little bit about who's getting the money, what interventions and what activities those funds can be used to support. We want to dive a little bit deeper into the key housing programs that have been appropriated over the last 18 months. Next slide. So just a reminder that the handout that Kim put into the chat earlier has this chart actually embedded in it, so you don't have to take notes. You can just download that handout. And so we're going to dive deep into these 4 programs, but I just want to give everybody the lay of the land first. So the first program that we'll be talking about is the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. It is the largest program in terms of housing resources that have been appropriated over the last 18 months, almost $50 billion. It was done in 2 tranches. There are 2 expenditure dates that we need to keep our eyes on, 2022 and 2025. And there are a variety of eligible households, including those folks who are at or below 80% of area median income, are experiencing hardship due to COVID-19, and who are at risk of homelessness or housing instability. The second is the $4 billion that was appropriated as part of the CARES Act. That's the ESGCV dollars. The expenditure requirement there is 9/30 of 2022. And those funds are based on the regular Emergency Solutions Grants Program with some changes that are specific to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is really targeted to people who are experiencing or at very high risk of homelessness, and was distributed into allocations. The emergency housing vouchers are at $5 billion. We estimate that it's between 62 and 70,000. I believe HUD has been saying 70,000 vouchers, and that distribution was based on relative need and local capacity. And again, are oriented towards people who are currently or who have recently experienced homelessness, or who are at risk of homelessness, and survivors of domestic violence. And then the last funding stream that we're going to focus on today is the homeless assistance through the Home Investment Partnerships Program at $5 billion. This program is a little bit more complicated because, as Matthew said, it does have the capacity for capital investments. So obligations have to be completed by 2025, but expenditures do not have to be completed until 2030. And these funds are targeted towards people who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness, survivors of domestic violence, veterans, and other populations sort of who are at the greatest risk of homelessness and housing instability. And I want to note one thing before we go to the next slide, and that is Again, that eligible household line has a wide variety of folks in it, but really our underlying value and our underlying strategy is to ensure that no matter what type of assistance you're talking about, you are really focused on ensuring that those with the highest needs are served first. Next slide. So Kim, I'm going to ask you to put the next link into the chat. We actually have a handout on the Emergency Rental Assistance Program that's available on the framework's website. It is a teeny bit out of date. We're working on getting that to reflect the newest guidance that Treasury has released. But what it does is gives you a really good feel for how to target these resources to households and neighborhoods who are at highest risk. And I'm not going to go into every single detail. There's a lot of details in this slide. I want to highlight a few items here. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program can pay for both arrears and prospective rent. So that means that for folks who are behind on rent but haven't yet gotten steady income, we can pay for both their back rent to make their landlords whole and to make them whole, but also support their rental assistance needs going forward. It also means that we can support people who are currently experiencing homelessness and are exiting homelessness to a permanent location where they have a lease, and use the prospective rent in order to support people exiting homelessness. And that has been clarified recently by the Department of the Treasury. 10% of these funds can be used for services to help maintain housing stability. And I also want to note here that the Treasury guidance, as the administration has the administration has developed additional guidance since January. It really has been focused on allowing flexibility at the state and local level for things like documentation. It allows and encourages self-attestation and self-certification so that folks are not required to jump through a whole lot of hoops in order to have access to these funds. I know that this is something that local governments are struggling with, but I would just put a finer point on this, that flexibility is really key to getting these dollars out the door and into the hands of tenants and landlords who really need it. So, yeah, please go ahead.
So this is another thing that I would encourage folks to look into as they think about COVID prioritization, right? Because the COVID waivers around coordinated entry also allowed us to waive a lot of substantive documentation requests there. And so if basically at this point on many things, we are allowed to take people's word on things and or do administrative match. And it's the best our system's ever been. And so if you haven't leaned hard into lowering those barriers, please do. Particularly when we're thinking about, again, historically vulnerable populations and populations that we don't often consider. I cannot tell you the number of people I have spoken with who are like, I don't have my documents, my house burned down, right? Or I was fleeing violence, I don't have my stuff, right? And that our system has for so long been built on prove it to me before we can offer you any assistance, and we're finally rotating away from that. I mean, to Matthew's point about we can actually demonstrate that stuff works inside these new kinds of justice-based frameworks. This is our chance to do that. I will also just say, I think our staff teams are much happier not having to go through making people prove that they're suffering. So if you haven't leaned into it for some other reason, just lean into it for your team.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth around low barrier. Really what we're encouraging here is to be as low barrier and flexible as possible. And I really like that what you just said, Mark, about this being a proof point for justice-based frameworks. if you think about it that way, we can change the way that our systems work in the long run by doing this work with this emergency rental assistance funding. And again, while the priority for these funds might be at households below 50%, we would encourage folks to really target these resources down at 30% of area median income and below. Next slide. I'm not going to get into the details here. They're laid out on the slides. And as we noted, we're going to be posting this webinar and we have a handout. So I just want to note a couple of things before I turn it over to Matthew. There are a number of expenditure deadlines included in the two laws that make up the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. And while those expenditure deadlines create urgency, we have tools that are available for you all to use that we'll talk about a little bit later to ensure that you are addressing the needs of people in historically marginalized neighborhoods or who have been historically marginalized. So don't let urgency sort of allow you to turn away from using an equity-based approach. Outreach is incredibly important, and we are going to go into much more detail around how to use these dollars in next week's webinar. Matthew, turning it back to you.
Great. So I'm going to talk about the Home ARP program next. The next slide, please. This is the resource that was referenced earlier that does allow for capital investments. And when we talk about prioritized uses for resources, I do think communities need to think about this as a capital source first and see if it allows them to bring units online, the development of affordable housing or permanent supportive housing. It allows for the acquisition of non-congregate shelter sites, could be sites you're currently operating as non-congregate shelter or other facilities that could be converted to permanent housing or affordable or continue to operate as interim housing. Also allows for tenant-based rental assistance. And different than a regular home program, it does allow for some use of funds for supportive services. The guidance that will structure the details of how this program needs to be implemented are being developed by HUD right now. We're expecting them, they're working on them very quickly, so hopefully soon. And that includes defining the supportive services that could be eligible for use with the home funds. But I think people can think about this as primarily like the regular home program, and the uses that are allowed within the regular home program are allowed within this program, and also just has some nuances and additional potential uses. So you can plan thinking about it as the regular and then add flexibility as you get more guidance from HUD. Focusing on, again, the same range of households currently experiencing homelessness, those are at risk. Again, we'd emphasize focusing on trying to serve people who are currently experiencing homelessness as your first priority, but include within that populations who have experienced violence, populations who need supportive services to prevent their ongoing instability, and households with veterans are also meet these criteria for eligibility for the program. I think there was a question within the question and answer box around uses of these funds or what funds can be used to acquire land. Site acquisition is one of the eligible uses for home program funds. So this could be used to secure a site, while other funding sources are aligned in order to develop units. Next slide, please. Status of these funds are a little bit different than most of the other ones in that you don't actually have them in hand to start spending right now, but they have been allocated to communities. So your community knows how much of the home funds are going to be received. This is, again, a mix. Some go to the states who administer them to some jurisdictions, and then other funds are going directly to participating jurisdictions. So you know how much money you have at the local level if you're a participating jurisdiction, and can start to plan for how those funds could be used. Waive some requirements, including matching requirements, very important waiver there. And the funds are except for the fund, we need to reword that, but we can't make sense of that one, but except for funds used specifically for administration, they are available through September 25. So I think they need to be obligated by 2025, and then you have a longer expenditure period. And up to 15% of the funds can cover administration. We'll talk a little bit more about kind of how to think about prioritizing the uses of these funds in just a moment. Next slide, please. Emergency housing vouchers. This is, I think, one of the more exciting elements of the resources that have come into communities, like an actual scaling up of vouchers for people who need long-term subsidies in order to be stable and successful. They are emergency vouchers. They are basically have the same uses as regular vouchers. There's some additional ways to help people access units, targeting people who are homeless or at risk of homeless, people who have experienced violence, people who are recently homeless, and this could help prevent them from falling back into instability. There again, 70,000 vouchers have been allocated. This is definitely one of the very urgent topic of conversations in communities, as continuums of care and public housing agencies need to be working out their memorandums of understanding right now. I think the deadline comes up week after next, I think, to have an MOU in place to structure the relationship and the roles and the administration of the programs. HUD's guidance does give COCs and the coordinated entry systems fundamental roles in identifying people to receive these vouchers. Kim, if you could put the link in the chat box for the message we issued late last week around prioritization for emergency housing vouchers, and offered our thoughts collectively as the framework partners about where to whom these vouchers should be prioritized. This is again one of those opportunities to act urgently, but don't move so quickly that you can't reach people who have the greatest needs for these kinds of subsidies in your communities, and look for every opportunity you have to align services resources with these vouchers so that the vouchers can support the stability of people who have higher acuity, higher service needs, who really need this intervention and this connection of both the rental subsidy and the services in order to be successful. Next slide, please. So HUD has notified PHAs, so in communities they know. I think we have to update that bullet too, but so PHAs had the opportunity to accept these vouchers and also asked if they wanted more. At least down the road, there may be some reallocation of vouchers. They have to be used within a reasonable period of time, or they may be recaptured. One thing to be thoughtful about these vouchers is they are not time-limited vouchers. They are ongoing subsidy vouchers for the households who receive them. The distinction of these from other housing choice vouchers is that the household who has this voucher in hand on October 1, 2023 can continue to receive the subsidy as long as they need it and as long as they participate in the program. After that date, households who turn back in a voucher, that voucher cannot be reissued. So it is not time limited for the households who participate, but it does sunset in that after September 2023, the vouchers can't be reissued if they are turned in by the participating households. And now next slide, please. So Emergency Solutions Grant CV program, Ann talked about this program earlier. This one is actually more in the realm of things that your community should have already decided how you're expending it, hopefully be making a lot of progress on expending it, and hopefully have prioritized uses aligned with many of the targeting criteria that we've talked about. HUD put a strong emphasis on these resources being used for rapid rehousing as a way to exit people from homelessness right in the midst of the pandemic and as we seek recovery from the pandemic. But would flag these resources in many communities are being slow to be spent, and an expenditure target, I think it's on the next slide, if you want to go to the next slide, at least 20% of these funds need to be expended by September 30th, 2021. That is like, we could count the days till September 30th. It's getting very close. And then 80% by March of 2022 with a deadline of September 30th, 2022. So this is also an opportunity in your community. If your original plans for these resources are not playing out the way you thought they would, or capacity challenges have limited your implementation, be very thoughtful about the opportunities to rethink your strategy and repurpose funds and make sure you're both hitting these deadlines, but also expending them into strategic programs that can best support reductions in people experiencing homelessness and align with your equity goals. So this I think is an area in which many communities need to come back together and have a real conversation amongst themselves about how it's going, what should they be doing differently, and do they want to repurpose their thinking about the use of these funds. Next slide, please, which I think goes back to, nope, that's me again. So this chart, which again, you'll get the deck afterwards, is it in many ways organized to think from the top to the bottom and to think first about the uses at the top. And then if that doesn't seem like the best strategic use in your community, think about the next bullet. And is that the best strategic use? And then think about the next one. So for ERA resources, really think about how you can use it to drive progress on preventing entries into homelessness, and focus as much as you can on that. And then think about diversion, and then exiting people, and then eviction prevention. ESGCV, as I just touched upon, really thinking primarily on rapid rehousing first and diversion strategies, but it can also be used for an array of other interventions that can support people. Emergency housing vouchers, I would say both of these bullets are the things you should be thinking about. That it is tenant-based rental assistance, permanent affordable housing, and trying to use as many of them to create tenant-based supportive housing opportunities for people with the services in place that they need. And here, I think we touched upon that move on strategies, which create PSH opportunities for people, is also a strong and thoughtful use of these resources. For the home funding, my encouragement to communities is first look at how much you're getting, and can it help you bring units online and actually expand the inventory of affordable and supportive units in your community? And can you make a deal happen with that infusion of resources? And only if you decide that that's not an effective use or you don't have that opportunity, start to think about the other uses, and start to think about tenant-based rental assistance or interim housing opportunities. If you're creating interim, you may think about the flexibility of over time converting those into permanent units, or they could be sustained as non-congregate shelter. And again, the home program under Arp allows for supportive services, but I wouldn't think of that as your prioritized use of home resources. Next slide, please. So this slide just provides you to some of the official guidance for these programs from the different federal agencies. So you'll be able to link directly to the pages that can allow you to delve more deeply into each of these programs. And then the next slide, please. And this goes back to Ann.
It does go back to me. Thank you, Matthew. Before I ask Mark the next tough question that I'm going to ask them, we also wanted to highlight 2 additional funding sources or funding streams that aren't housing specific, but that we think communities or folks in communities that are serving people experiencing homelessness and housing instability really should be aware of and considering. And the first is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. This fund, the money flows to local school districts from the states. So it could be a good opportunity to partner with your local school district to really identify families who are experiencing housing instability and homelessness that schools know about, in order for those families to be served with housing. It pairs wraparound services from the Department of Education. I'm going on vacation soon, so just bear with me today. You can pair wraparound services through this program that are coming from the Department of Education with either the emergency housing voucher units or the emergency rental assistance funds. And that could be a really good way to help families exiting homelessness. And then the last thing I wanted to note here, that it's really helpful for communities and individual programs to be working with their educational McKinney educational liaisons, so they can both actively participate in the continuum of care, and that there can be sort of communication and collaboration with the use of these funds. Or if you have an existing relationship with your McKinney liaison, really amplifying that relationship in order to maximize the use of these funds. And then next slide. Services are a huge topic of conversation. You heard Mark talk a little bit about services. Matthew also mentioned them. We are going to be doing a webinar specifically on services in August, and we know that HUD is also doing a series in conjunction with HHS on how to tie the housing resources and service resources that are available through ARP. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of areas that while you're waiting for those webinars to launch, you might want to be thinking about. We know that that expanding Medicaid eligibility in states that might not have expanded Medicaid is really important for racial justice and equity. So taking advantage of any ARP funds that are in place for non-expansion states. The home and community-based services can really help. The funding that's available through home and community-based services can help seniors and people living with disabilities live in the community instead of in institutions, and really help with behavioral health needs as well. The mobile crisis response funding can really be a tool to help reduce criminalization of homelessness. COCs or individual programs can partner with mobile crisis response teams to identify people and provide outreach services to people who are living in unsheltered locations. And then lastly, there's a number of behavioral health grants. These are flexible funds that can cover services, training, and other activities. The funds go to states, and those funds are often regranted to providers. So these are just another set of resources that are potentially available to continuums of care and folks who are implementing these programs. But Marc, I'm going to turn back to you for just a minute.
We just about the health stuff first. Sorry.
Oh no, that's actually exactly what I was going to ask you about. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, so before whatever the question is, I will say, if you have a lot, if you're working with homelessness, you're probably working with a lot of folks of color. Health and thinking about health frameworks here really matters, right? Particularly as we think about exiting COVID and the disproportionate impact that COVID has had. I remember being on a call with Ann and Matthew in early 2020, right? And saying, well, this is going to ravage Black and Native communities. And and it did, right? And that wasn't like, I'm not a particularly good, fortune teller, unless I'm Cassandra, right? Because it took a while to get other people, Ann and Matthew listen, but other people did not listen. And so it's still really critical that you be thinking about how you take these kinds of health funding availabilities and integrate them with how you must be approaching historically marginalized communities right now. I will also say that is really, really, really elevated when we talk about our Native and Indigenous populations, who are often, particularly depending on tribal affiliation and status, right, may have some right to healthcare via tribal government, right, and also we have large urban Native populations that are accessing what we would consider to be sort of mainstream healthcare, which is a word that I hate. But in those instances, right, like we need to be particularly mindful and thoughtful about how we build out frameworks that actually understand the people who are seeking care, right? And what I hear over and over and over again from our historically marginalized communities, right, is like beyond even just the care itself being provided in a way that isn't respectful or dignified, the frameworks that the care understands wellness through are not aligned with how they understand wellness, right, or in how their communities understand wellness. So again, like we have an unprecedented opportunity from both a funding and flexibility standpoint to really do that work. And as always, right? Like it's got to be done too fast, and it's got to be done like it has to happen 6 years ago. But luckily, a lot of people have already been doing it for 10 years, right? So that gets back to Ann's question about like what tables are you convening? And the answer is go find the tables, because people have had these conversations. And if you show up saying we will resource what you've already talked about, they will probably let you in the door, versus if you try to call a convening to discuss a thing that they have already tried to tell you about previously. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, you actually spontaneously answered the question that I was going to ask you, which is really about how services impact equity. And you know, is it still, have you figured it out? Is it still an outstanding, is it still an outstanding issue in your community? I would imagine it probably is. This is very complicated and you haven't had a whole lot of time, but you know, any insights that you have for folks on how to get those, how to get these resources paired up?
We haven't figured it out, and there's still a lot more to do, because I did start April 26th.
What?
But I know, right? What am I doing with my time? But I will say that, like, I can tell you where we're headed, and what I would advise, right? Which is peers, 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 peers. Like the peer navigation and peer supports frameworks are the most successful frameworks we've seen with engagement for both, frankly, high levels of acuity and historically marginalized populations. They have been successful in the substance use space, in the behavioral health space, in the mental health space. We know it works. We know it works to talk to someone who you think shares your experience and who probably does, right? And is able to help you navigate whatever the complexity of the system is. I respect and am undertaking my own system integration initiatives, but we need to be clear that when we talk about system integration, we're talking about 5, sometimes 10-year projects, right? And people are outside today, and a 5-year timeline is not appropriate, it's not responsible, and it's not ethical. And in that space, right, peer navigators and peer frameworks allow us to build out connective tissue that can span a fragmented system, dramatically altering the experience and outcome that that system can produce, while frankly not having yet addressed the fundamental fragmentations. And you can parallel track those things, right? You can drive a system fragment or system integration agenda at the same time that you more rapidly stand up peer supports across your system. Another nod for Medicaid expansion is that in Medicaid expansion states, peer supports are more readily reimbursable than in non-Medicaid expansion states. And so for those of you who are system administrators like myself, who are always like, this costs a lot of money. If you are in a Medicaid expansion state, you have to have a certified host agency, and the peer has to ultimately be certified. But those two things in process, or those two things complete, mean that the work that person does is fully Medicaid reimbursable. And that's huge, right? In terms of the ability to spin out a large peer workforce that can engage. It also allows us to do what we say we want, which is to move people with lived experience into the driver's seat of delivering the stuff at an equitable wage, right? And so we really need to be thinking strongly about what it looks like to move towards peer navigators as our primary sort of deployment, right? In and around our service architecture. And I think that, that again, like we see this inside the DV space, inside the Native communities, inside the LGBTQI communities, to some degree, the youth communities, right? It's stuff we already do. Now we need to integrate it into our systems and bring it to scale while we have the opportunity to do so. And the only other thing I would say about about service deployment in this particular space, right, is again coming back to that question of acuity. And I'm gonna say something that's a little bit tough. I think I might be channeling Nan Roman, which is always like, what's happening? I love Nan, just so we're all clear. Nan is amazing. She's a good friend of mine, but people do not expect me and Nan Roman to be like, no, that's true. And what I'm gonna say, right, and what I've heard Nan say for years is, don't become another system. It's not a sustainable path, right? Do not attempt, when you are looking at acuity, to replicate a brand new behavioral health system inside yours. It won't work. And that, I think, is real tough, because what we are called to do, right, is provide the support that people need. But what we have to understand is that to do that, again, at scale and responsibly would require the integration of skills and training that our system is not yet set up to absorb. And so this is another place where the partnerships are really critical, right? So on that acuity stuff, right, where people are experiencing deep end behavioral or mental health needs, you need to be in conversation today, right, with the best providers you have in that space, some of whom probably are straddling, right, the line between multiple systems, but you need to pull them in real tight so that you are having a real clear conversation about how, as people who are coming in from outside who have those acute needs are identified, that they are going to be matched with a reimbursable service or a funded service stream, right, that can support them. I think, again, when we look at the statistics, we should be clear that only about 20% of people are going to have that level of need, but that you got to lay the track well in advance of identifying them, right? You need to have a way of building a care plan, building that warm handoff, having hopefully a peer navigator who can hold all that across both systems, right? That's the ideal here, because again, driving a system integration between behavioral health and homelessness is a 10-year project, and replicating behavioral health within homelessness is not a great idea and is a 5-year project. So we just need to be really clear about how we're going to do that. I recommend, again, reaching out to your providers, your managed care organizations, right? And beginning to have that conversation today about how you're going to make that work.
That makes a lot of sense, Marc. Thanks. Next slide, please.
Great. And I think we're going to move through these slides very quickly. So Ann, we're going to move very quickly and hopefully get a few of the questions that have come in answered, but we are running up against our end of time here.
Yep.
Next slide, please. Here, just wanted a big blue dot that said, we know this won't be easy. Felt like we could do an entire webinar about how all the ways that this is hard and difficult, and how hard and difficult and challenging the last 16, 18, however many months has been for homelessness providers and housing providers. So just want to acknowledge on the front end that this is hard and it's not getting easier, but the opportunity is too great to allow ourselves to pass on. Next slide, please.
And so as you think about your policies for an implementation of these dollars, we encourage you to really focus in on a few things. Person-centered and low barrier approaches, balancing your investments in supply with the other resources that you need to address rehousing and affordability, like rental assistance. That's particularly key for how you think about the home program. House services, as we just discussed, are made available to program participants. And then on the implementation side, using equity-based decision-making processes, ensuring that you're working with those non-traditional partners and that you're working with people with lived expertise. And don't forget shelter in all of these discussions. Non-congregate shelter was something that a lot of communities implemented. How can you work that into your plans? Next slide, please. So everything that we've just talked about really leads to the next two slides. And the first is, as you're thinking about allocating your money, what tips do we have for communities? And the first is something that hopefully you've heard loud and clear from all three of us today, which is serve those with the highest needs first. And that means you need to fully scale homelessness rehousing efforts and homelessness diversion before you're investing in the other prevention resources. Partner with people with lived expertise. They, as Marc pointed to, if you're not doing that, you're missing out on brilliance. So please do that. And establish targeting features in your eviction prevention programs to make sure that the lowest income households with the greatest housing insecurity are prioritized with those funds. Next slide, please. Yeah.
And I think we've touched upon almost all of these repeatedly, so I'm going to just highlight a couple that we might not have been as explicit about. bullet, build capacity with non-traditional partners, to think about organizations in your community who could be delivering the kinds of interventions you're trying to fund, but who need capacity support, and to think about this as both an equity strategy and a capacity strategy, and to bring more capacity into your provision of and the mobilization of these resources, and to identify organizations who may have been left on the margins of your responses and to bring them into the center of your responses. And then the bullet, set bold goals. I think this is one of those opportunities to try to think about rallying behind a vision of what can get accomplished with these resources in your community, and then strive as hard as you can to drive progress towards those goals, and to focus on equity-focused goals within your scaling and your intervention goals. Next slide, please.
This is one of the best tools that I have seen communities use. It is part of the framework project. The link is on the right there. But what this really allows communities to do is to look at three sub-indices: housing instability, impact of COVID-19, and equity. And putting those three sub-indices together to really focus in on those neighborhoods within your community that have really been impacted by COVID-19, and that, not surprisingly, often are the same communities that were redlined as part of our housing, racist housing history. So this tool is available to everybody. The data gets refreshed on a regular basis. I think it was last refreshed in April. And I would encourage everybody to take a look at that tool as you are thinking about targeting. Next slide.
And this slide just lists a lot of the tools and resources that have been created as a part of the framework project, including tools that we've linked to in the chat box and hopefully people can access. Also want to highlight the tools around equity-based decision-making guide and what we heard from people with lived expertise or experience. Those were tools that Marc's former organization, NIS, led the development of and helped think through how to centralize those decisions and those strategies within all of your decision making. There's a variety of literally hundreds of tools and resources that we've gathered around federal funding sources, state and local examples, all housed at the housingequityframework.org website. And in addition, I think Kim just put into the chat box, Urban Institute is also in the process of rolling out some case studies as a part of this project, profiling communities, how they have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, and what are they doing differently moving forward as a result of those experiences. I think those are just beginning to roll out and will be more officially launched in early August. Next slide, please.
So join us for the next set of webinars. I hope that before we get to Q&A, just wanted to put it on the screen one more time. Today is that foundational webinar. Next week, we'll dive a little bit more deeply into funding and implementing an equitable rehousing continuum. Barb Poppy is leading that one. We'll have some really good communities spotlighted there. On August 5th, we'll be talking about landlord engagement and unit cultivation strategies, which I know is a big ticket item for folks right now. And then later in August, we'll be talking about services and maybe doing a 5th webinar if we can. But with that, I think that we'd like to take some questions that are in the Q&A. Matthew, do you want to see what's up? What do we want to answer?
Unfortunately, I only have a few minutes, so I'm going to look quickly here, but I think there are a few questions that have to do with flexibility. And Ann, you might know the Emergency Rental Assistance Program better than Marc or I in detail. I'm not sure, but there are a couple questions about the ability to serve people who are in informal living situations, and especially can young people be supported through ERA to remain in informal or hosting or kinship kinds of housing environments, or would they need to use that assistance within formal lease agreement settings?
So I think, off the top of my head, I'm not sure that the emergency rental assistance guidance from Treasury specifically opines on the issue of informal living arrangements. But what I would say is that there there are broad flexibilities that are provided to recipients at the state and local level that that really could be helpful in situations like that. And serving youth is something that we've been talking about in the framework team, and the Alliance has been talking about it, as well as our partners at Youth Collaboratory and True Colors and Away Home America. So I would absolutely think about how youth can be served, whether they are in informal situations or not. And I think that the program should provide that level of flexibility. I can certainly double check on any of the requirements and put them out when we put out our next messaging.
Great. I'm going to see if I can just quickly knock off a couple of questions here. So there was a question related to updating housing units and ensuring that those units go to low-income families. So I think within the implementation of any of these resources, and this question might be most about the home program, as those units are developed at the local level and the project level, there should be careful targeting criteria put in place and really thoughtful marketing strategies to ensure that they are. But that's probably something that has to happen operationally at the local level as these funds get implemented. Similarly, there's a question about emergency housing and its accessibility, especially for people with disabilities. That should be a fundamental value in the deployment of any of these resources. There's a question later on about the definition that is used for disability for the emergency housing vouchers, which I believe is the same definition that HUD uses for household disabilities for all of its programs. I don't think there was any change in that definition for emergency housing vouchers. And then maybe we'll just close with one top question for Mark. You talked a lot about the role of peers, and the question came in, you talked about the opportunity within Medicaid, Medicaid expansion states. If you're not in a Medicaid expansion state, what would be your top tips for how to think about bringing more peer roles and capacity into your programs?
Repurpose your outreach dollars. I mean, that's the fastest way, right? Look at your budgets that are currently dedicated to outreach and see how they can become peer navigator budgets. And to be honest, right, like we're talking about a switch in designation, but we at the outreach level, we employ a lot of people with lived experience. We just don't ask them to use it, right? Like instead we ask them to split their identities up and pretend that they don't actually have this experience, or that they don't have that experience in a family member or someone close, right? So like, that's where I would say is like, think about whether or not your outreach workers can become peer workers. And that's a shift in model, but it may not be a shift in people.
Great.
Matthew, I just want to note that Barb Poppy, who is on with us today, kindly put the answer to the question that I got on informal agreements into the Q&A, and I just copied it into the chat. So thank you so much, Barb.
Great. And apologies that we couldn't get to the questions that came in. We'll look at them. Well, some of them we might punt to and see if Barb can weave them answers into her webinar next week. Or otherwise, we'll try to find other opportunities to answer them. And any closing thoughts from you?
I just want to thank everybody. I thank you, Mark, for making time for us today. Thank you, everybody who is on with us, for all the incredibly hard work you are doing on behalf of people experiencing homelessness and housing instability across the country. I know that we are so appreciative, and we will, please keep in touch with us. We will keep cranking out materials. This project is supported by the Melville Charitable Trusts and by Funders for Housing and Opportunity. So we will be continuing to put out materials. If you have specific things that you want to see from us, if you go to the next slide, Kim, there is, that's our website. There's an email address on that website that we respond to. So please let us know. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Matthew. This was fun.
Great.